Regular listeners of My Dark Path know of my great affection for China and the city of Shanghai in particular. I had an episode all about Shanghai in Season 1 of My Dark Path called Genuine Fakes. It was all about the history of Shanghai, the origins of Chinese theater and film, and the industry that produces genuine fakes, or luxury knockoffs that can almost pass for the original. My fascination with the city has extended even further in my research and writing. My fourth novel, Like Clockwork, is a spy thriller set in the city of Shanghai. And if you'd like to support me in the show, you could consider purchasing it or my other novels on Amazon and other online bookstores. Now, I've lost track of the number of times I've been to mainland China. It's an astonishing country, from the rise of modern cities like Shanghai to the likely permanent societal effects of the one-child policy to the beautiful human kindness I've found in people I've met across the country. Two dear friends from Shanghai even found their way into the novel, under other identities, of course. But what continues to amaze me is the history of the country that stretches well over several millennia. And this fact reminds me of a quote from philosopher George Santayana, who wrote, quote, "He who forgets history is doomed to repeat it," end quote. Now, that idea has many useful applications as we observe some of the insanity present in today's society, but it's also intriguing to flip the premise around and allow me to suggest that he who seeks to learn history is humbled by it. I use the word humbled here to observe that despite having more knowledge at our fingertips than ever before, we can also be filled with hubris about our supposed knowledge instead of being in awe of the past, which we can only briefly glimpse. So, let's take a quick look at a fragment of history which can be easily overlooked. In 1974, Chinese archaeologists discovered a junk, a term for a Chinese ship, that was abandoned sometime around the year 1270 in the port of Quanzhou. On board was cargo that conclusively proved the ship had been up and down the east coast of Africa. Subsequent investigations showed extensive contact between Africa and China from as early as 800 AD. Chinese coins and pottery have been found in archeological digs in East Africa from present-day Somalia to Tanzania, and even a few artifacts in present-day Zimbabwe. During the Yuan Dynasty from 1279 to 1368, Mongols ruled China, and little exploration and trade with overseas nations took place. But in the periods before and after, especially during the Tang and Song dynasties, roughly from 618 to 1130, the Chinese were both curious about distant nations and desirous of trade with them. The east coast of Africa, all of Asia, and perhaps even the coasts of Americas were visited by Chinese ships in search of information, novelty, and trade. Now, we know historically that the Chinese have gone through periods of exploration and trade with distant nations. China had contact with Africa during the Han Dynasty, which lasted from 206 BC to 220 AD. In the book Universal Christian Topography by 6th century Byzantine monk Cosmas, Sri Lanka is described as a trading center for both Chinese and African sailors. A Chinese map from the 14th century shows Madagascar and the southern tip of Africa nearly 2 decades before the Portuguese discovered the Cape of Good Hope. This is not to mention the Silk Road, which linked trade between China and Europe from the 2nd century BC to the 15th century, and whose most famous traveler was Italian merchant Marco Polo. Europe at this time lagged behind the Chinese when it came to maritime exploration and trade. In 1414, during the Ming Dynasty, which was established when the Chinese overthrew the Mongols, driving them both from power and the Chinese nation, a Chinese admiral sailed into the Indian Ocean with a fleet that dwarfed Columbus's meager ships 78 years later. This voyage marked the 3rd time the Admiral had sailed the Pacific and Indian Oceans, exploring the world. He brought back information, trade goods, and a giraffe, a gift for the Emperor of China. So join us today as we sail the dark paths of the Pacific and Indian Oceans with Zheng He, also called Zheng He, the Chinese Columbus. Hi, I'm MF Thomas, and welcome to My Dark Path. In every episode, we explore the fringes of history, science, and the paranormal. So if you geek out over these subjects, you're among friends here at My Dark Path. Now, we're putting out new videos regularly on YouTube. One commenter gave us a like and said, "And you look so normal too. I like normal people with twisty brains." Well, dear viewer, thank you. I'm glad that us twisty-brained people have found each other. And if you like My Dark Path, check out our Patreon, where subscribers have access to exclusive full episodes, starting with our special mini-series, a My Dark Path tour of history, science, and the paranormal in Cold War Moscow that we're calling Secrets of the Soviets. You can find us there at patreon.com/mydarkpath. Finally, thanks for listening and choosing to walk, or in this case, sail the dark paths of the world with me. Let's get started with episode 52, The Chinese Columbus. Part 1. Some historians theorize that Chinese explorers reached the west coast of the Americas around 458 AD, over a millennia before Columbus reached the Caribbean. We know that in 1559, Spanish explorers sailed from the Philippines to present-day Acapulco in Guerrero State on Mexico's Pacific coast. Over the next century, Spanish galleons roughly followed the routes of Chinese junks that knew of the winds and the currents and had been along American coasts upon occasion over centuries since 458. Sometimes driven by storms and at other times for trade or exchange of native culture. Long before the Europeans began sailing the dark seas, seeking first trading partners and then lands and people to colonize and convert, the Chinese had sailed the same seas as explorers. And the man that is considered by China to be greater than Columbus, oftentimes called the Chinese Columbus, is Zheng He. Columbus, as every American child knows, had 3 ships on his first voyage: the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. The Nina and Pinta were tiny by today's standards, only 50 to 70 feet from bow to stern each. The Santa Maria, Columbus's flagship, was slightly larger as a heavy cargo vessel. The Nina had 20 sailors and the Pinta 26. The Santa Maria had a crew of 40. These 86 men in Columbus spent 35 days crossing the Atlantic to land on the island of Hispaniola, present-day Dominican Republic and Haiti. And interested listeners, by the way, may remember our history of Hispaniola on Season 2, where we recounted the story of the Parsley Massacre in the lands of the mountains. If you haven't heard it, please go check it out. Now, later voyages would feature much larger ships with far more crew and soldiers, designed to begin the conquest and exploration of the New World. As we learn at an early age about Columbus, I suspect it is hard for the modern mind to think about exactly how small these ships were and how terrifying these initial voyages must have been. But let's remember that the Chinese were ahead of the Europeans at this point in terms of technology, maritime exploration, and the sheer size of ships. By contrast to Columbus's tiny, in every sense of the word, fleet, Zheng He had 62 heavy junks, called treasure ships, in his fleet, as well as over 100 auxiliary vessels. He traveled with a full armada. The largest of his ships had 3 decks and weighed 1,500 tons each. Columbus's ships in total weighed 450 tons. That's all 3 ships together. Cheng's largest ships had 9 masts and 12 sails each. They were said to have measured 440 feet long and 180 feet wide. All 3 of Columbus's ships would have fit inside Zheng He's largest ship with room to spare. And in contrast with Columbus's 86 sailors and officers, the official record states that Cheng's contingent was 93 commanders, 868 civil officers, 26,800 soldiers, 140 senior captains, who were in command of about 1,000 men each, 403 captains, who commanded 100 men each, 180 medical officers, 7 ambassadors, 2 military judges, for crimes committed by men during the voyage, 53 eunuch chamberlains, 10 junior eunuchs, a senior secretary of the Board of Revenue, who is there to ensure the voyage paid proper taxes to the emperor upon return, and a geomancer. The last is a practitioner of geomancy, a method of divination that interprets markings on the ground or the patterns formed by tossed handfuls of soil, rocks, or sand. The Chinese version is called Feng Shui, which means wind-water, and is a traditional practice that claims to use energy forces to harmonize individuals with their surrounding environment. The onboard Feng Shui geomancer would study landscapes and the water to understand and interpret the flow of qi, a universal energy that flows through all things. The fleet would voyage successfully if the commanders followed the advice of the geomancer, who would instruct them on the most fluid and harmonious paths of travel that would keep the fleet in harmony with the environment. Now, apparently this practice was useful as the fleet continued to be, as you'll see, very successful. Like Columbus, Zheng He was supported by the government, which encouraged his voyages. Like Columbus, he undertook multiple voyages of discovery. But unlike Columbus, he was a eunuch of the court of the emperor. Zheng He also had no personal financial stake in the voyage. He served at the pleasure of the Son of Heaven, and nothing he brought back was his, and no honors would accrue upon him. And unlike Columbus, Zheng He sailed where others had already sailed. What separated him, however, was the size and scope of his fleet and his voyages. The emperor who sponsored Zheng He was Zheng He, formerly known as Chu Ti, and we'll talk more about that later. He reigned from 1402 to 1424 AD. Zheng He had been a soldier who deposed a younger, gentler relative who had sat on the imperial throne. In order to make his regime more legitimate, he claimed his predecessor was still alive somewhere in the Indian Ocean, plotting against China. The fleet was first mobilized to find this deposed monarch. A secondary objective of exploration and trade was also given, and Zheng He charged the eunuch admiral with scouring the territories of the Indian Ocean to find luxury goods for the court. He presided over an era of wealth and expansion, and after his death, the name assigned to this era was Yongle, or the time of lasting joy. Zheng He's ships carried Chinese silk and porcelain for trade, and as a result, the fleet was sometimes called the treasure ships. They initially set out for Arabia. Centuries before, the Chinese had established trade with Arabia, seeking Islamic pottery. The same Mongol invasion that resulted in the Yuan dynasty in China, however, also reached as far as what we now call the Middle East, and the trade was interrupted. The voyage of Zheng He was in part thus to re-establish this trade route. The Chinese learned, however, that Islam had spread down the east coast of Africa, and thus it might be possible to trade there instead of Arabia. But Zheng He was destined to bring home more than just pottery or a missing monarch. Like Columbus, he had multiple voyages. In Zheng He's case, there were 5, 2 more than Columbus's 3, and each subsequent one took on greater significance for international relations, as well as Zheng He's own reputation at home. Zheng He's first voyage began in the summer of 1405 with a fleet of 63 large ships and 255 smaller support vessels, with a total crew of 27,800 men. The fleet set out from Lu Chai Kang at the lower estuary of the Yangtze River, passing my much-admired Shanghai on the way to the East China Sea, where they turned south through the South China Sea, passing through the Malacca Strait, where a pirate named Chen Shu-ai had been marauding for years, preying on Chinese trade vessels and local fishermen and voyagers alike. Zheng He demanded Chen's surrender. At first, Chen said he would comply, but then he attacked Cheng's fleet, killing 5,000 of his men and burning and sinking 10 of his ships. Zheng, however, captured Chen and his lieutenants, pacified the Malacca Strait, and made it safe for Chinese trade. He then returned to the court, presenting Chen as a gift to the emperor, who had the pirate executed publicly in October of 1407. Zheng He then refurbished his fleet and, in the autumn of that year, set out on his second voyage. Part 2. Zheng He was born in 1371 in Kungyang in central Yunnan province. His family name was Ma. We know his great-grandfather was named Bayan, and his grandfather and father were both named Haji. This rather unusual name suggests the family had visited Mecca in Saudi Arabia and were actually of the Islamic faith and possibly of Mongol Arab descent. Indeed, his Muslim heritage might have been one of the reasons why he was selected as the Admiral to the Middle East and Africa, his familiarity with the customs and beliefs of Islamic nations. He also recruited a Chinese Muslim named Ma Huan to serve as an interpreter for Arabic-speaking countries. And upon their return from the voyage, Ma Huan wrote a memoir of all he saw and did, and it's one of several detailed records we have of Zheng He's journeys. At the beginning of the Ming Dynasty, the generals fighting on the front lines of western China were responsible for recruiting men to serve as eunuchs in the imperial court back in Beijing. In 1381, Yuan was pacified by the Chinese army, and the generals sought intelligent young men for this purpose. And at the age of 10, Zheng He was recruited and castrated so that he might serve the emperor as a eunuch. The practice of creating and using eunuchs at court has existed in China since about 146 AD. It initially began as one of the so-called 5 punishments, possible penalties on the body for criminal offenses in early China. The others included tattooing, cutting off the nose, amputation of the foot, full castration, and death through dismemberment. Later, becoming a eunuch was perceived as a more positive thing, a means of entering into the high ranks of imperial service. At some point in imperial court history, self-castration became a regular occurrence in order to secure promotion. Eunuchs were believed to be reliable and dedicated imperial civil servants, as they could not have children and thus could not beget a dynasty, and thus remained focused on their work instead of a family, and would not betray the emperor in order to replace him with themselves and their children. Castration as a punishment was banned at the beginning of the Ming Dynasty, thus leaving only voluntary castration for the creation of court eunuchs. Zheng He fell into this category. By the time he was an adult, court eunuchs were responsible for every aspect of court life, every department in the imperial palace, and much of the military. Their presence and power increased significantly, driving Confucian scholars and other court officials to accuse eunuchs of spying, intrigue, and plotting against everyone else. They were also not trusted because they were allowed to serve in the harem of the emperor and to be alone in the presence of women of the imperial family, as they were perceived as representing no threat. As their power grew, so too did their reputation for being cunning, greedy, and duplicitous. Literature from the period often features an evil eunuch plotting against some young man or woman. Yet many palace eunuchs served faithfully and well and led China to success in trade, military encounters, and efficient government, and that was the world Zheng He entered at the age of 10 when he was castrated and joined the imperial service. He was assigned to the entourage of Chu Ti, the 4th son of the Ming emperor and celebrated military strategist. By his early 20s, Chang had accompanied Chu Ti on a series of military campaigns throughout China. Zheng He's family records note, quote, "When he entered adulthood, he reportedly became 7 feet tall and had a waist 5 feet in circumference. His cheeks and forehead were high, but his nose was small. He had glaring eyes and a voice as loud as a huge bell. He knew a great deal about warfare and was well accustomed to battle," end quote. While his size was likely an exaggeration, his fearsome appearance and military skill were not. Reading more about the process and consequences of making eunuchs, I've studied a few clinical articles about the effects of castration, and I've left links to a few of them in the show notes on the website. But before the expeditions that made him famous, Zheng He achieved renown as a soldier and commander. He fought the Mongols north of the Great Wall from 1393 to 1397 and distinguished himself as a mighty warrior. When the Ming Emperor Chu Ti's father died, in keeping with imperial and Confucian tradition, the eldest grandson, Chu Yuwen, son of the emperor's eldest son, became emperor. Chu Ti did not believe his nephew would be a good emperor and so launched a civil war with the same troops that had successfully fought the Mongols north of the Great Wall. During the Chu Ti rebellion, Zheng He fought on his behalf, leading the blockade of Beijing in August of 1399, and then led the southern campaign that ended with the capture of Nanking in July of 1402. Chu Ti became the emperor and Zheng He became his most trusted advisor. The previous emperor, Chu Yuwen, fled China and vanished somewhere in the South Seas. The search for Chu Yuwen is allegedly what inspired Zheng He's first voyage, as I mentioned earlier. But once he set out, Zheng He seemed to forget the search for the previous monarch and the quest for trade and knowledge, pacifying the Malacca Strait and bringing a pirate king back for the emperor's justice. So now the second voyage of Zheng He entered the Indian Ocean in late 1407. His mission was to sail to Calcutta in India and establish trade and territorial understandings with the local rulers. Zheng He was there to deliver gifts and greetings to the king, as he had often sent tribute and gifts to the Ming court. This set the pattern for how Zheng He encountered other cultures: an arrival full of ceremony, a greeting to the local monarch, and the offering of gifts. In Calcutta, a pavilion was erected to celebrate the occasion, the visit of Zheng He, and the new understanding between the Son of Heaven and the King of Calcutta. Zheng He and his fleet then sailed on to Java, which was not a united nation but a group of principalities ruled by warlords. The Chinese referred to the two most powerful as the East King and the West King. Now, unaware that the East King had gained ascendancy and was now the mortal enemy of the West King, Zheng He landed on the part of the island that he thought was controlled by the East King and sent greetings to the West King, thinking him to be the East King from the Emperor of China. This misunderstanding initiated a terrible consequence. The West King slaughtered 170 of Zheng He's men before realizing the fleet was as large as it was and that he was now facing down Zheng He's army. The West King then offered 60,000 gold coins to make up for the loss, but Zheng He simply deposed him and set up an ally of the East King on the throne of the West King and promptly left. Java did not become a colony of China, and Zheng He simply removed the monarch who attacked him and replaced him with someone who would not make the same mistake. And by the summer of 1409, Zheng He had returned to Nanking to report the results of his second expedition. He built a temple in honor of Tianfei, the goddess of the sea, as thanks for her protection and guidance during the voyage. And remember that Zheng He was a Muslim, and so this act may have been as much political as it was devotional. He then spent a few months in the capital in service to the emperor, but it was not long before the Son of Heaven again sent his greatest admiral out to sea again. Part 3. From September 1409 to June 1411, Zheng He sailed to the Malabar coast of India, with stops along the way in Siam, Malacca, Sumatra, and Ceylon, or modern-day Sri Lanka. The fleet harvested lumber along the way, both to repair the ships and also to bring back exotic woods to China. They stopped in the Semblian Islands to gather and trade for fragrant herbs. The third voyage of Zheng He is best known for two events. The first was an exhibition in Sri Lanka, in which Chinese products and crafts were put on display in public. Silk embroidery, gold and silver candlesticks, textiles, incense burners, Buddhist ritual objects, and Chinese pottery were all presented as examples of Chinese craftsmanship and potential trade goods. To commemorate the occasion, a tablet was erected at the site with the same message written in Tamil, Persian, and Mandarin. Amazingly, this tablet is still present in Sri Lanka, and one can stand on the spot where Zheng He displayed the best of Chinese finery. However, the second event that occurred marred the visit. The local monarch, King Alagakarana, wanted all that Chinese finery, not to mention Zheng He's fleet, for himself. He attacked at midnight as the fleet readied to sail on to India. Zheng He, as we know, was a master strategist. King Alagakarana was captured by the Chinese soldiers who took him and his family and ministers prisoner, bringing them to Nanking for judgment from the emperor. Chu Ti offered respect to his fellow monarch and, in an act of mercy, ended up releasing the entire group, who were then set free and sent home, perhaps a little more wary of attempting to fight the emperor's navy, and thus ended the third voyage of Zheng He. And now we come to 1415. Just as Henry V was headed toward Agincourt in France, and in Rome, Pope Gregory XII resigned, becoming the last pope to resign until Benedict XVI in 2013. A giraffe arrived in Beijing from Melinda, Kenya, as a part of Zheng He's famous and fateful fourth voyage. Now, a few years before, another eunuch admiral had sailed into the Bay of Bengal to trade with the local Indian government, and while there he saw a giraffe recently carried to India by envoys of the King of Malindi. A new king had just been enthroned in Bengal, and the giraffe may have been a gift from his fellow Muslim ruler. The Chinese were fascinated by the giraffe and wanted one for their emperor. The King of Bengal offered his giraffe as a gift to the Chinese emperor, and the Chinese flotilla took it and sailed back to China, but were concerned that a single animal on a long voyage might not make it. A decision was made to go to Malindi, establish diplomatic relations, and get a giraffe for the emperor from the source. For context, Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese explorer, met with Muindi Mu of Malindi in 1498, 84 years later. Muindi Mu is the chief of chiefs who speaks for the people, which the Portuguese translated as king. The Chinese had been there about a century earlier. Less than 2 years after he had returned with the entire royal court of Ceylon as his prisoners, Zheng He was again sent out in 1413 with the express purpose of acquiring more giraffes. This time he had 63 large vessels and hundreds of smaller auxiliary craft, totaling over 400 ships and boats, and 27,000 men in his fleet. This expedition once again touched on a number of new sites and encountered a number of cultures for the first time. Zheng He visited the Maldives, Hormuz in the Gulf, and the Hadramaut coast in present-day eastern Yemen, as well as the Gulf of Aden. Stopping in Sumatra, just as in Java, Zheng He was drawn into a local political struggle. A usurper named Su'ala had murdered the previous king and taken the throne. Zheng He would not have cared otherwise, but Su'ala then ordered the Sumatran forces to attack the Chinese fleet. He was defeated and fled, but Zheng He ordered some of the fleet to pursue him while the rest of the fleet continued on. Su'ala was eventually captured in Lambri in northern Indonesia, along with his family. They were held prisoner by Zheng He for the rest of the voyage and then brought to China with the rest of the tributes and envoys from Africa almost 2 years later. During this fourth voyage, Zheng He sailed down the Madagascar Channel and sailed as far south as the Kerguelen Islands, which are actually closer to Antarctica than they are to Africa. Some historians theorize other Chinese sailors might also have sailed all the way to Australia around this time. Zheng He also established bases as he went, allowing small parts of the fleet to go on side missions, representing the Chinese emperor to dozens of cultures. And when Zheng He returned to Beijing from this voyage, he not only brought a giraffe, but he brought envoys from 19 nations to pay tribute to the Ming court and establish diplomatic relations. Zheng He's fleet arrived in Malindi in 1414, there mostly to get a pair of giraffes. Word had spread from the previous envoys that the Emperor of China really liked giraffes, and that the other African animals might also make a most auspicious gift. The giraffe itself has had a mystique that has made it a favorite of kings and commoners alike throughout history. Giraffes are the tallest living terrestrial animal, not to mention the largest grazing herbivore, and are found naturally only in sub-Saharan Africa. Its height, up to 19 feet in an adult male, unique coloration, and an exotic physiology have made the giraffe a global source of fascination. The ancient Egyptians depicted them in images and kept them in captivity, sending them to other ancient Mediterranean civilizations. An ancient African people called the Kiphians actually created a life-size rock engraving of two giraffes over 8,000 years ago, and that's believed by some to be the world's largest rock art petroglyph. The Chinese believed that the giraffe was a unicorn of some kind, despite the fact that it had two horns. Julius Caesar brought the first giraffe to Rome in 46 BC, where it was displayed for the masses. The later Romans told stories about them and brought many back to Rome, including several to fight in the Colosseum. The Arab nations revered the giraffe as a sacred creature and shared stories and images of them with Europeans during the Renaissance. In 1486, explorers from East Africa gifted a giraffe to Lorenzo de' Medici in Florence for his zoological garden. It would be 350 years before another giraffe would set foot in Europe. In the early 19th century, the Sultan of Egypt sent a giraffe as a gift to Charles X, the King of France. On June 30th of 1827, more than 100,000 people gathered in the streets of Paris to welcome the arrival of the beast they referred to as the tall horse. In retrospect, it seems as though to observe a giraffe is to then want one, or many, for your nation. And more recently, Salvador Dali considered the giraffe to be a masculine symbol, and in his paintings, a flaming giraffe was meant to be a masculine, cosmic, apocalyptic monster, whatever that means. By December of 1416, Zheng He was back in Beijing with his prisoners, Sua La and his family, as well as the envoys and ambassadors of 19 nations. Also arriving at this time were two giraffes, a gift for the emperor from the king of Malindi. The envoys who later returned to Africa noted the delight of Chu Ti as he laid eyes on a giraffe for the first time. He was overjoyed and enthralled to have, in his own private menagerie garden, two of these masculine, cosmic, apocalyptic monster unicorns. Now, those envoys reported to their nations that the way to gain the emperor's favor was to gift him with unique animals, and so on his next two voyages, his final ones, Zheng He would return to China with a number of African animals: lions, leopards, camels, ostriches, zebras, rhinos, and antelopes, all gifts to the emperor so that he might appreciate the variety of African animals. But giraffes, however, remained his favorites. Part 4. Zheng He's fifth voyage most likely went no further than the Persian Gulf. His sixth and final voyage saw Zheng He head straight for Africa. On both of these voyages, he again met with local rulers, brought gifts from China, and in exchange brought gifts, including, as I've said, a number of animals back to the Chinese court. These voyages might have continued but for the loss of his benefactor and king. Emperor Chu Ti died in 1424. The death of his patron and protector resulted in the downfall of Zheng He as a major player in the Chinese government. With the death of Chu Ti, the critics of the voyages of Zheng He and the Confucian bureaucrats, the longtime adversaries of the court eunuchs, conspired to dismiss the eunuchs, including Zheng He, from their positions. The next emperor, Chu Kaochi, was Chu Ti's son, who only reigned 9 months before dying himself. Although Chu Ti had promised to stop the expeditions in 1421, it was not until September of 1424 when Chu Kaochi, as one of his first acts, canceled Zheng He's maritime expeditions permanently. Various accounts from the period claim that the new emperor either ordered the fleet to be burned or ordered that they be abandoned on the beaches to decompose. After the death of Chu Kaochi, his son Chu Chanchi authorized one final voyage of what was left of the fleet. But after that, the isolationist policies of the bureaucracy won out, not the least of which was because the expense of maintaining and provisioning such an expensive fleet was proving to be unsustainable. His seventh and final voyage took Zheng He back to some of the same nations he had first visited decades before, sailing through the Indian Ocean from 1431 to 1433 at the behest of the grandson of his mentor. The fleet set out to return to Beijing with more giraffes, horses, and elephants for the new emperor. By this point, however, Zheng He was in his 60s and had led a long and challenging life. It's likely he stayed with the main fleet, and smaller groups were sent out to places from Mecca to Malindi to again offer a gift exchange from China. It's here where the historical record offers conflicting accounts of the end of the voyager and the eunuch who brought these exotic animals to the court of China and the court of China to the lands of the Indian Ocean. One account has him dying in Calcutta and the fleet returning with the giraffes and elephants without him. Another account has him returning to China and passing upon his arrival back at court. But we do not know where he died or even where his final resting place may be. He has no tomb, no monument. His private life remained remarkably private, not the least of which was because he was a eunuch and had no family to honor or remember him. Regardless of where he ended his days, as the Chinese historian Cheng Huisheng observes, quote, "He had sailed the longest distance and covered the widest expanse of water during his lifetime of anyone in the world up until then," end quote. And this was true, of course, of almost anyone in the century to follow, including Columbus. And it was not until Ferdinand Magellan circumnavigated the globe in 1521 and 1522 that someone finally exceeded the duration and distance of Zheng He's voyages. Sadly, by 1470, Zheng He's own records of his voyages were burned by bureaucrats as unsuitable for human inspection. Perhaps this was a final attempt by the enemies of the eunuchs to remove any memory of Zheng He and his accomplishments. And this is also a reminder of us today to be wary of anyone who declares that the past is evil and its memory ought to be destroyed. By that same year, only 140 ships from a fleet of over 400 remained as China retreated from exploration and trade by sea. Zheng He's accomplishments were downplayed after his death by those who wished to discount him and his expeditions, but his career was too large and expansive to be erased, and I hope that we've shown that here. To do what he did, Zheng He must have been a man, a leader, and a sailor of extraordinary abilities, and there are at least 6 temples in the South Pacific and in China that bear his image and celebrate him as the greatest explorer in Chinese history. Zheng He was a Muslim leading expeditions for a nation predominantly Buddhist and Confucian. He himself was interested in Buddhism, and despite his success with Muslim heads of state in the Gulf and in Africa, he eventually took on the Buddhist name of Fushan. As Edwin Raschauer and John Fairbank note in their history, East Asia, the Great Tradition, quote, "The voyages of Zheng He must be regarded as a spectacular demonstration of the capacity of the early Ming China for maritime expansion, made all the more dramatic by the fact that Chinese ideas of government and official policies were fundamentally indifferent, if not actually opposed to such an expansion. The contrast between capacity and performance as viewed in retrospect from the vantage point of our modern world of trade and overseas expansion is truly striking," end quote. Now, equally fascinating is the idea that by the end of the 15th century, the Chinese and the European explorers in the south of Africa and the Indian Ocean were often near each other within a few days of sailing, and yet their paths never crossed. They heard of each other from various African communities, but Europeans and Chinese never met at sea during this century. Imagine what might have happened, what reports might have been sent back to the crowned heads of Europe had a Portuguese or Spanish ship run into Zheng He's fleet of 400 ships. Imagine what might have been if the imperial bureaucracy, rather than burning Zheng He's ships and records, funded further missions past Africa and into the Atlantic. What might have happened had the British woken up to 400 Chinese ships anchored off the coast? History might have gone very differently indeed. Thank you for listening to My Dark Path. I'm MF Thomas, the creator and host. I produced the show with our creative director, Don Purdy, and this story was prepared for us by Kevin Wetmore. Huge thanks to them and the entire My Dark Path team. If you'll take a moment, please give My Dark Path a rating and a review wherever you're listening. This really helps the show, and we love to hear your feedback. Again, thanks for walking the dark paths of history, science, and the paranormal with me. Until next time, good night.